The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at St. Michael's Hospital in Colorado Springs, that particular pitch that never quite faded from consciousness once you'd heard it long enough. 3 years. That's how long Hannah Clarke had been pushing through those doors at 5:47 in the morning, when the night shift still owned the hallways and the coffee tasted like burnt rubber. The antiseptic smell had become part of her skin by now. She stopped noticing it somewhere around year 2, the way soldiers stop hearing ambient gunfire. Cold stainless steel gleamed under the harsh white light of the third-floor cardiac unit, and her scarred hands moved through the morning routine with the kind of precision that made seasoned nurses stop and watch. Hands that had done more than most people would ever know. Hands that had held things together when holding together seemed impossible. The patients loved her. That was the quiet fact nobody said out loud, but everyone knew. An elderly woman recovering from bypass surgery would ask for Hannah specifically when her oxygen saturation dipped. A diabetic grandfather would wait for her to check his blood glucose because she never made him feel like a failure for the number on the meter. A young mother 3 days postpartum would relax her shoulders only when Hannah entered the room, as if some invisible weight lifted just from her presence. They couldn't have articulated why. It wasn't her bedside manner, though she had one, it was something else. Something that lived in her hands. Something that suggested she'd held worse things than their fear. But respect from patients didn't matter in hospital hierarchies. Respect from patients was invisible to everyone who mattered. What mattered was the pedigree. Yale School of Nursing or bust. Duke. Johns Hopkins. Places with names that could be dropped into conversations at department meetings. Hannah had come through the military nursing pipeline, 8 years as a combat medic before the Pentagon quietly told her she needed to disappear, needed to become someone new, needed to become invisible in a way that meant living a life that looked like everyone else's. She'd gotten her RN through a program that wasn't on anyone's wall of prestige, and that fact had become her permanent limp in the eyes of people like Dr. Marcus Pierce, who worked the cardiac unit with the bearing of a man who'd never once questioned whether the world owed him a throne. Pierce had arrived 2 years ago, recruited from Denver with the kind of fanfare that involved hospital administration emails and LinkedIn announcements. He had the credentials, Harvard Med School, a fellowship at Mayo, publications in journals Hannah couldn't have accessed without passwords she didn't possess. He also had the look of someone who'd grown up believing that excellent bloodlines and excellent institutions produced excellent people, a formula that had never required him to question what excellence actually looked like in a crisis. The first memo had appeared 6 months into his tenure. A single sentence flagged on her performance review, recommend further credential verification, question regarding scope of practice on clinical decisions. Not specific. Not actionable. Just enough to plant the seed. Then another memo, 3 weeks later, detailing a medication administration where she'd questioned a dosage that seemed high for a patient's weight. The memo didn't mention that she'd been right and the dosage was adjusted. It mentioned only that she'd questioned a physician's order. Then another. And another. Small things. Paper cuts. The kind that add up over time until you bleed out from something no single wound could have caused alone. Hannah had learned long ago not to respond to cuts. You respond to a cut in a combat zone and you bleed out faster from the stress response than from the wound itself. So she didn't challenge the memos. She didn't request meetings. She didn't argue. She simply continued to move through her shifts the same way she moved through everything, with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst version of this situation, though Pierce had no idea that was where that calm originated. But on a Tuesday in October, something fractured the carefully maintained surface. Room for 12, a 68-year-old contractor named Michael Hoffman, had come in 3 days earlier with chest pain that the stress test supposedly ruled out as benign. He'd been improving steadily, walking the halls, appetite returning, joking with the aides about wanting real food instead of hospital broth. Hannah had checked on him at 6:52 in the morning, noting the slight blue tinge to his fingernail beds that didn't match his oxygen saturation reading. The pulse oximeter said 94%. Her hands, though, said something else. Her hand said the oxygen wasn't getting where it needed to go, which meant somewhere between his lungs and his bloodstream, something had broken. A pulmonary embolism. A blood clot somewhere in the pulmonary artery, the kind of thing that could kill a man in seconds if it was large enough, the kind of thing that stress tests sometimes missed because stress tests measured the electrical activity of the heart, not the physical architecture of the lungs. She'd pulled the chart, seen the pattern in his history, a long flight 2 weeks before admission, sedentary work, the statins and high blood pressure meds that suggested underlying vascular compromise. All the ingredients. And she'd walked directly to the nursing station where Dr. Pierce was finishing his morning rounds. Need a repeat imaging on Michael Hoffman in for 12, she'd said quietly. Chest CT with contrast. I think he's throwing a PE. Pierce had looked up from his laptop, the expression shifting through microseconds of confusion to something that looked like contained irritation. The stress test was negative, he'd said. His oxygenation is fine. His nail beds are cyanotic, Hannah replied. And his oxygen sat is stable at 94, which is low for a patient without previous respiratory disease. You're a nurse, not a radiologist, he'd answered, and then returned his attention to his screen. Not hostile. Not yet. Just dismissive. Hannah had simply walked back to 412 and called radiology herself, using the physician referral protocol that technically required doctor sign-off but which she had the authority to initiate understanding orders for things like new symptom patterns. The CT came back 60 minutes later. Massive pulmonary embolism. The kind that would have killed Hoffman sometime in the next 4 to 8 hours, probably while he was sleeping, probably while everyone was busy with other patients. A clot the size of a marble lodged in his left pulmonary artery, cutting off blood flow to almost 30% of his lung tissue. The thing that happened next was what made Pierce's calculation begin. Hoffman's family had been in the room when Pierce arrived to discuss the imaging results, and he'd been midway through explaining the urgency of anticoagulation therapy when Hannah had entered to recheck vital signs. Pierce's voice had shifted. It became the kind of loud that fills a room, the kind that makes people in the hallway unconsciously turn their heads. I'm glad you're here, he'd said, and his smile had been the kind that a predator might wear before the strike. The family was just asking about the diagnostic process. Hannah, you made the recommendation for this imaging, correct? She'd said nothing. Silence was safety. I'm asking whether you, as a nurse, took it upon yourself to override my clinical judgment and order imaging without a physician order, Pierce had continued, and his voice had dropped to something quieter but somehow more pointed. Because what I'm concerned about, Michael, can I call you Michael, is whether we can trust the clinical judgment of a medical professional with, shall we say, unconventional training. Field medics are excellent in emergency settings. But we practice evidence-based medicine here. Rigorous medicine. Medicine that follows established protocols, not intuition. Hannah had felt Hoffman's daughter tense beside the bed. Felt the wife's hand grip the blanket tighter. Felt the weight of that moment settling into the room like a low-pressure system. And then Hannah had taken one measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath that could be heard if anyone was listening, the kind that separated one moment from the next with surgical precision. The patient is still breathing because I called the imaging, she'd said. Her voice had been quiet. Level. The kind of quiet that made people listen harder instead of strain to hear. His oxygen sat would be 72 in 6 hours without anticoagulation. In 8 hours it would be unrecoverable. She'd turned back to Hoffman's for, checking the placement with her fingertips, working with the kind of focus that suggested she'd already moved past the moment and Pierce's face would have to work harder to reach her now. Pierce had stood there for a few seconds longer, and then he'd finished his explanation about anticoagulation and left the room, but something had shifted in his expression. Something that looked like calculation. Something that looked like a decision being made. The break room became a different place after that Tuesday. Not visibly. Nothing overt. Just a slow migration away from her presence. Staff would gather their lunches in the morning and distribute them through the common areas, but when Hannah sat down with her coffee at the small table by the window, conversations would gradually pause. One nurse would remember she needed to check on a patient. Another would remember a supply order. Within 5 minutes, the room would be empty except for her and the fluorescent hum and the smell of cold coffee in a pot nobody had bothered to refresh in hours. A formal write-up appeared on the unit board. Not directed at her specifically, that would have been too obvious. But a memo about scope of practice, about the importance of physician-nurse collaboration, about the Joint Commission regulations regarding diagnostic recommendations from nursing staff. The memo cited no specific incident. It didn't need to. Everyone knew. Hannah had read it 3 times. Once for comprehension. Once to check if she'd missed something. Once more because sometimes reading something twice helped locate the rational part of yourself that could separate the words from what they meant about who you were. She'd felt that single tear escape down her cheek somewhere during the 3rd reading, but she'd wiped it without breaking eye contact with Pierce across the nurse's station, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch or fold or shrink into herself. She'd folded the memo carefully and put it back where it had been, as if the paper itself had never touched her. What happened next wasn't dramatic. It was something quieter. More insidious. It was the kind of thing that happened when someone with institutional power decided to slowly compress the space around you until breathing became work. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later when Michael Hoffman's room received a visitor who didn't leave, who sat in the chair by the window watching Hannah work with the kind of intensity that suggested he was reading something in her movements, something coded in the way her hands moved, something that shouldn't have been readable at all. General Joseph Matheson was recovering nicely from his own cardiac event, a stent placement, routine now, the kind of thing that hospitals handled with practiced efficiency. He was 72 years old, with the bearing of someone who'd spent for decades giving orders and having them followed without question. He'd been sleeping most of the afternoon when Hannah had come in to check his telemetry leads and adjust his 4, but he'd opened his eyes as her hands reached for the monitor, and he'd gone very still. Baghdad, he'd said. Just that word. Like a place, a time, a recognition happening in the space between one heartbeat and another. 2009. Camp Victory. Hannah's hands had stopped moving. She'd learned to hide things in her face, but her hands were another story. Her hands remembered things her mind had been ordered to forget. You're the one who did the field anastomosis on Lieutenant Rhodes. When the Humvee got ambushed en route Irish. Matheson's voice had been quiet, he knew something about discretion too. I was commanding that battalion. I watched that operation. He'd paused. I watched you. She'd pressed a finger to her lips. A single gesture loaded with everything that couldn't be said out loud. The order to disappear. The official erasure. The files that had been redacted and buried and locked behind doors that supposedly didn't exist. The Pentagon's quiet instruction that surfacing her history would endanger everyone she'd ever served with, some operation that had gone sideways in Anbar province, some extraction that had required witness elimination at the level of intelligence agencies. Matheson had watched her for a moment longer, and then he'd nodded. He understood. He'd been in the system long enough to read the silence between words. She'd reached into her locker later that shift, when the hallways were quiet, and she'd pulled out the small flag. The folded triangle, the way they always folded them, the crisp edges, that particular geometry that meant something about honor and sacrifice and the cost of staying alive when others didn't. Lieutenant Rhodes' flag. She'd kept it for almost 15 years, hidden in every locker, every apartment, every place that mattered enough to keep a secret in. She'd shown it to the general without speaking. Just the flag. Just the folding. Just the message that some debts couldn't be repaid, only honored. Matheson had looked at it, and he'd reached out and touched the fabric with the kind of reverence you'd use with something sacred. And he'd nodded again. The kind of nod that meant he understood she couldn't talk about this. That he wouldn't ask. That some silences were more important than any words could be. The break room at St. Michael's smelled like burnt coffee and stale ambition. Hannah sat in the corner with her lunch, a turkey sandwich, apple, water, and watched the room empty in real time. It was a choreography she'd learned to read like vital signs. Nurse Morrison would glance at her, then at the door. Respiratory tech Jennings would stand, sandwich still half uneaten, and murmur something about needing to check on the supply closet. Within 90 seconds, the room that had held 8 people would hold 1. Dr. Pierce had engineered this with surgical precision. It started 3 days after the pulmonary embolism incident. The break room conversation, meant to be overheard, designed to plant seeds, came from Pierce himself, leaning against the refrigerator like he owned it. Hannah was in the bathroom, but respiratory therapist Morrison was there, and Morrison had a weakness for gossip the way hospitals have a weakness for fluorescent lights. Field training is useful, I suppose, Pierce had said, his voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured concern. But there's a reason we practice evidence-based medicine here. Not cowboy medicine. Not reflexive interventions that happen to work once and create dangerous overconfidence in someone without proper credentials. Morrison had nodded. Said nothing. But he'd remembered every word. By day 5, the phrase cowboy medicine was circulating the unit like an infection. By day 7, Nurse Chen had used it in front of 2 residents. By day 9, it had metastasized through the entire department, a diagnosis of Hannah's competence delivered with the kind of clinical precision that made it impossible to refute without sounding defensive. And Hannah never defended herself. She sat in the break room and absorbed each departure like a monitor reading a flat line. 1 measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. Her hands never trembled. Her face never flushed. She simply watched people choose their comfort over her presence, and she understood what Pierce was doing because she'd seen it before, not in civilian hospitals, but in the field, where isolation was a weapon that moved slower than bullets but with more certainty. The isolation had a mathematics to it. 3 weeks of exclusion. Staff meetings where she sat in the back and no one made eye contact. Assignments suddenly routed through other nurses. A patient complaint form appeared, unsigned, undated, claiming she'd been abrupt during vitals. Pierce distributed it widely enough that everyone saw it, rare enough that she could never prove who filed it. Then came the write-up. It was posted on the unit bulletin board on a Tuesday morning at 6:06 a.m., right where the schedule went, where everyone would see it. Formal letterhead. Pierce's signature at the bottom. The words were surgical, incident report, insubordination and practicing beyond scope of practice. The complaint cited her interference with Dr. Pierce's clinical decision-making regarding the pulmonary embolism patient. It invoked Joint Commission standards about scope of practice and cited hospital policy 4.2.7 about nursing chain of command. It was a masterpiece of institutional weaponry, nothing crude enough to be indefensible, just specific enough to feel official. Damning. Hannah read it twice. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't quicken. But somewhere in the architecture of her chest, something small and quiet broke like a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall. She was still reading it when Pierce walked past. He didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge her. Just slowed enough to glance at her face, and Hannah saw it, the moment he registered her reaction. Not triumph exactly. Something colder. Calculation. The look of a man confirming that his weapon had struck exactly where he'd aimed. 1 tear escaped down her cheek. Just 1. Hannah wiped it with the back of her hand, not looking away from Pierce across the nurse's station, maintaining eye contact the way she'd been trained, the way you maintain eye contact with something dangerous that might attack if it smells fear. Her jaw didn't clench. Her voice, when she finally moved away from the bulletin board, didn't crack. She simply folded the copy of the report she'd taken and placed it in her pocket. Went back to work. The break room stayed empty when she sat down for lunch. Chen left within 4 minutes. Morrison never came at all. Even the newer nurses, the ones who hadn't yet learned which way the institutional wind blew, took their meals to their cars or the locker room. One of them, Sarah, third-year med student doing a clinical rotation, hesitated in the doorway for a full 10 seconds, her lunch tray balanced in her hands, clearly weighing peer pressure against basic human decency. Hannah looked at her sandwich instead of at the girl. She heard the door close 5 seconds later. By that evening, the entire nursing staff had seen the write-up. By the next morning, it had reached administration. By the following shift, HR had added their own notation, flagged for review. The words carried weight that grew heavier with each hour, accumulating like blood in a dependent wound. That night, around 2:13 a.m., the hospital's quiet hours, when the night shift skeleton crew moved through corridors like ghosts, Hannah was restocking a medication cart on the 4th floor when alarms erupted from room 408. The general's monitors lit up like a Christmas tree. Code blue announcement echoed through the hallways, and she heard the pounding of feet, the crash cart being wheeled, the particular controlled chaos of a cardiac event happening in a hospital with trained staff nearby. Dr. Pierce was in the building. He'd been reviewing charts in the physician's lounge. He arrived at room 408 at a run, residents trailing behind him, and he shouted orders with the kind of authority that came from tenure and credentials and the unspoken assumption that he was the smartest person in any room. Get me a 12-lead EKG stat. I need an open 4-line, 2 if you can get them. Push 1 milligram epi, now. The general's heart wasn't responding. The flat line stretched out, a continuous tone that seemed to press against Hannah's sternum like a memory she'd spent years trying to bury. The ventilator hissed. Medication drips ran. But nothing was working, and Pierce's orders were becoming more frantic, less decisive, the subtle shift that happened when competence began to collapse under pressure. Hannah stood in the doorway with the medication cart. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. But something else was happening in her body, a shift as specific and immediate as a switch being thrown. Muscle memory. Combat conditioning. The particular clarity that came when you recognized that someone was dying and the people in charge had no idea how to stop it. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. The monitors went haywire at 2:13 a.m. General Matheson's chest began seizing in irregular patterns, atrial fibrillation spiraling toward something worse. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but beneath that sound came the one every nurse dreads, the dropping saturation alarm. 88. 85. 82. Hannah was at the med cart updating fluids when the first alert hit. She moved toward room 408 before the second alarm sounded, her feet already knowing the way her mind had unconsciously chosen. The general lay rigid, his face the color of old concrete, sweat pooling at his collarbone. His eyes found hers across the chaos of the room with an expression that said everything. He was still conscious, and he was running out of time. "Get the crash cart," she called out, her voice steady as a surgeon's hands. 2 residents materialized from the hallway like startled birds, Dr. Sharma and Dr. Okonkwo, both competent on paper, both completely untethered in the actual storm of a cardiac emergency with no attending physician within earshot. The on-call cardiologist was 20 minutes out. The ER was drowning in a 12-car pile-up 3 blocks away. At St. Michael's at this hour, the unit belonged to the nurses. "What's his rhythm?" Okonkwo asked, his voice climbing an octave. Hannah was already moving the crash cart into position, her hands assembling the defibrillator pads with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital room. VTAC converting to VFib. "We're losing him." The general's body went rigid. The monitor flatlined into that terrible tone, the one that strips away every pretense and leaves only survival. Okonkwo froze. Sharma started compressions, but they were shallow, mechanical, the movements of someone following a checklist rather than fighting for a life. Neither of them had the authority to make the critical calls. Both of them were waiting for someone else to take command. The room narrowed into a single point of focus. Hannah felt something shift in her spine, a realignment that happened in microseconds, muscle memory rising through 17 years of civilian nursing like a submarine breaking surface. This was different from the ER drills, different from the training videos. This was the moment where a patient stopped being a patient and became a mission objective. The temperature in her perception dropped. The noise fell away. Time fractured into usable units. "We need epi, 1 milligram 4 push, and I need someone prepping the chest," she said. Not a question. Not a request. Her voice had dropped an octave, and the room responded to it the way rooms respond to officers. "Let's get a 14 gauge in his right antecubital. Push it now." Sharma moved. The epi went in. O2 saturation, 62. Falling. The general's pupils were fixed and dilated, the kind of pupils that said the clock was moving from minutes into seconds. What they didn't know was that Hannah Clarke had learned her craft in a place where there were no protocols, no committees, no joint commission regulations standing between a patient and the difference between living and dying. She had done this in the rubble of FOB Victory with nothing but a combat knife, a bag of saline, and the knowledge that Captain Rhodes would bleed out in 90 seconds if she hesitated. The flashback came not as distraction but as precision. Baghdad, 2009. Sanjan Valley. The insurgent RPG had caught the Humvee's side panel and Lieutenant Rhodes had taken shrapnel across his chest, massive penetrating trauma, hemothorax, the kind of injury that required immediate decompression or death. She could see it now, his face beneath the dust. The way his lung had collapsed. The way she'd threaded the needle through the intercostal space and felt the hiss of air escaping, the blessed sound of pressure releasing, the return of oxygen saturation like a miracle written in numbers. She opened the crash cart and retrieved the scalpel in one fluid motion. "I'm performing an emergency thoracotomy," she said to the room. To Sharma. To Okonkwo. To whoever was listening. It wasn't a discussion. "Get me a chest tube and prepare for open cardiac massage." Okonkwo's eyes widened. "You can't." "Watch," she said. The general's chest was already exposed. Hannah's hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who had lived this moment 1,000 times in dreams and muscle memory. She felt along the intercostal spaces, the anatomical landmarks ingrained so deeply they were part of her nervous system, and made the incision in one practice motion. The blade went through skin and muscle and pleura with the kind of certainty that comes from having done it when the cost of error was a man's life. The hiss came. The release of air. The opening of a sealed system. "Saturation?" she asked, already positioning her fingers along the general's heart. 68. Sharma whispered. She could feel it, the fluttering, a rhythmic organ beneath her gloved fingers. Not beating. Fibrillating. She began the massage with a rhythm learned in a war zone where there were no ventilators and no backup plans. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Her hands found the heart's own language and spoke it. "Push another round of epi," she said. 1 milligram. Saturation climbing, Sharma said. 70. 75. 80. The general's heart responded to her hands the way a stone responds to a stone thrower. Reluctant. Slow. But responding. His body understood what his conscious mind couldn't, that Captain Hannah Clarke was doing this the only way it could be done, with the kind of pressure and timing that came from knowing exactly how fragile the human heart was and exactly how much force it could survive. 85, Sharma said. She could feel it now, a flutter becoming a beat. Irregular still, but genuine. The organ in her hands was no longer just tissue and electricity. It was winning. 88. 90. 92. The monitor transitioned. Not normal rhythm, but not flat line. The general's chest was rising and falling now with real breath, real oxygen, real blood moving through real veins. His eyes began to flutter. His fingers twitched. The color started returning to his face like a photograph developing. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Okonkwo stood motionless, watching her hands move across the open chest cavity with a kind of awe usually reserved for watching something sacred. Sharma had stopped speaking. Both residents were staring at the monitor, then at Hannah, then back at the monitor, trying to reconcile what they'd witnessed, a nurse. A floor nurse. Performing open cardiac massage with the precision of a trauma surgeon. "Get me a size 24 French chest tube," Hannah said, her voice steady as she monitored the cardiac rhythm. "And someone call the cardiac surgeon. This man needs to go to the OR." The general's hand moved. His fingers brushed hers. His eyes opened. "You," he whispered. Hannah met his gaze for exactly 1 second. In that second she saw recognition. Not of a nurse. Of something else. Someone else. But what he saw looking back at her was a woman wearing scrubs, covered in his blood, standing in a hospital room with two stunned residents, about to change everything without meaning to. Because when Dr. Pierce arrived 7 minutes later, when he saw the open thorax and the improvisational procedure and the general still breathing, he didn't see a life that had been saved. He saw a line that had been crossed. A boundary violated. A nurse who'd exceeded her authority in a way he could finally use to destroy her completely. And that was when the real nightmare began. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway of room 408, watching Hannah's hands move through the final moments of the thoracotomy with the kind of precision that belonged in a surgical theater, not a patient room. Her fingers worked the internal defibrillator pads against the general's heart, 2 firm compressions, then a pause. The monitor climbed. 85. 90. The green line steadied into a rhythm that meant sinus. The room exhaled. Pierce's face shifted. Not with relief. With calculation. His eyes narrowed as he processed what he'd just witnessed, a nurse exceeding her authority in a way he could finally weaponize. She'd performed a procedure that only physicians were authorized to do. She'd violated protocol in front of residents. She'd succeeded. All of it documented. All of it actionable. Within 60 minutes, Pierce had filed an incident report. The language was surgical, not angry, which made it more dangerous. He cited gross violation of protocol, invoked obscure Joint Commission regulations about non-physician surgical procedures, and referenced a section of hospital bylaws that most staff didn't know existed. The paperwork was immaculate. Dated. Witnessed. Carbon copied to risk management, the department he'd been lobbying for weeks. He'd planted seeds in conversations about liability, about institutional reputation, about what happens if that nurse operates on the wrong patient next time. By end of shift, the paperwork had escalated. Risk management had signed off. The decision had been made at the level where individual argument became irrelevant. Hannah was informed by a hospital administrator she'd never met, a woman with a jaw like a vice and eyes that wouldn't meet hers. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," the administrator said, sliding a sealed envelope across a desk in an office that smelled of leather and air conditioning. "Your final paycheck will be mailed. Your badge will be collected at the exit." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Hannah took the envelope without opening it. She didn't ask why. She didn't argue. She simply nodded, the way someone nods when they've already survived worse. She'd been trained to accept orders without debate. The difference was that this time, there was no mission. No objective. Just a door closing behind her. She walked to her locker, the same locker where she'd stored her scrubs for 3 years, where she kept an extra pair of compression socks and the folded flag wrapped in plastic that had never left her since Baghdad. The flag was from her team medic, the one who didn't make it out of the extraction. She'd kept it as a talisman, never showing it, never explaining it. Just a reminder of why quiet work mattered. Why saving lives in the dark was enough. Pierce intercepted her before she reached the exit, materializing from the administrative corridor with the confidence of a man who'd already won. His smile was the smile of someone who'd finally broken something he couldn't stand. "You understand why this was necessary," he said. It wasn't a question. Hannah stopped. She looked at him with eyes that had seen things his credentials and position would never touch. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into a register that made the nearby residents fall silent. "Because you needed to prove something." Pierce's smile widened. "Because people like you think the rules don't apply. I won't have this hospital's reputation destroyed by some jarhead with a hero complex." He said it the way he might discuss the weather, casual, certain, the voice of someone who believed he'd already written the ending. Hannah closed her locker. The sound echoed down the corridor like a period at the end of a sentence. She grabbed her jacket. The folded flag stayed in her pocket, against her ribs, the plastic crinkling softly with each breath. She didn't respond to Pierce. Responding would have required defending herself, and defending herself would have required telling the truth. The truth that she couldn't tell. The Pentagon had been explicit. The operation in Baghdad had been black ops. The extraction had gone sideways. Her records had been erased. She'd been ordered to disappear, to become someone else, because surfacing would endanger every operative still in the field. Every teammate still breathing. That was the deal. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Be no one. The paperwork trail Pierce had constructed was so meticulously done, so perfectly documented, that HR escorted her to the parking lot without hesitation. There was nothing to fight. No appeal process that would matter. Just the weight of institutional decision-making, the kind that destroys a person quietly, through procedure, through the accumulation of forms signed by people who'd never looked her in the eye. She drove home in silence. She showered. She stood in front of her bedroom window watching the rain begin to fall at 7:43 p.m., the kind of rain that Colorado Springs doesn't normally get, heavy, relentless, the kind that drums on glass like a warning. 5 hours later, she was in the hospital basement laundry room, folding her scrubs for the last time. The detergent smell was thick, industrial, familiar, the smell of 3 years of shifts, 3 years of quiet competence that had meant nothing in the end. Her hands moved with the same precision she'd used to fold a uniform once, back when she had rank and authority and a name that meant something. Now she was just someone who didn't exist. Someone who'd been fired for exceeding her scope. Someone who couldn't defend herself because defending herself would destroy other people. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her wrist, the same way soldiers do, not bothering to hide it because there was no one here to hide from. The plastic-wrapped flag sat on the folding table beside her, next to the stack of clean scrubs she'd just finished. She picked it up. Held it. For a moment, just a moment, she considered throwing it away. Becoming someone completely new. Someone without this weight. Someone who didn't owe anything to the dead. Her phone vibrated against the metal table. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But habit, muscle memory from a life she wasn't supposed to admit she'd had, made her pick up. Captain Clarke. The voice was clipped. Military. Someone trained. She didn't respond. There's been a development. A pause. The general woke up. First thing he asked for was the nurse who saved him. He's asking questions. Command thinks you should know that he's remembering details. Classified details. Her grip tightened on the folded flag. We're sending a team. ETA 12 minutes. You need to stay visible. Stay where you are. The line went dead. She stood in that basement laundry room, rain pounding the high windows, the smell of detergent and industrial bleach mixing with something else, the sharp ozone smell of a door opening that she'd thought was locked forever. Her hands were steady. They'd always been steady. That was the thing about trained soldiers. The shaking came later, if it came at all. The shaking came when you finally believed you'd survived. Outside, in the rain-soaked Colorado night, she heard it, the distant percussion of rotors, still miles away but moving closer. The sound of a military helicopter cutting through the weather, moving fast, moving with purpose. She didn't know what was about to happen next. She stood in the St. Michael's parking lot holding a cardboard box that contained the last 3 years of her life, a stethoscope with a military-issue carrying case, the clinical handbook they'd made her sign for, a photograph of the night shift crew from 2 years ago when they still invited her to coffee. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause for something nobody wanted to celebrate. 2:24 p.m. 5 hours since Dr. Pierce had placed the termination letter in her hands with the kind of smile that said he'd been planning this moment since the day she corrected him about the blood gas interpretation. She didn't see Ethan until he was already running toward her, his 16-year-old legs eating up the parking lot distance with the kind of urgency that made her hand tighten on the box. He was clutching something wooden, something she thought she'd hidden well enough in the attic crawl space behind the insulation and her old winter boots. Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to stop him, but the words didn't come. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, loud enough that the gathering crowd near the ambulance bay turned their heads, staff members taking smoke breaks, patients in wheelchairs waiting for discharge rides, visitors clutching coffee cups and concern. Loud enough that security would hear. Loud enough that it couldn't be taken back. The wooden case opened like a mouth confessing secrets. Inside, resting on navy velvet that had turned grey with age, lay the silver star with its 5-point center catching the afternoon light. Below it, 2 bronze stars positioned like subordinates. And the purple heart, not 1, but 2, the ribbon faded to the color of old wine. The world did not stop spinning. Worlds don't do that. But the parking lot did something worse. It held its breath. A nurse Hannah had worked with for 18 months turned to the person next to her and said nothing, which said everything. A male resident stepped backward as if gravity had reversed. The general was standing by the entrance in a wheelchair, the one who'd checked himself out against medical advice at 6:13 a.m. because he said his body had done enough healing in hospitals to last a lifetime. His hand rose slowly to his chest and he whispered 2 words that turned every Marine within earshot to stone. Valkyrie 6. It was a call sign nobody in Colorado Springs knew how to pronounce. It was a name that officially never existed. It was the call sign of a combat medic who'd been extracted from Baghdad in 2009 in a black helicopter after an operation went sideways in the Jolan district, the one that had killed 7 people she loved and erased her from every official record. A Marine colonel who was visiting his daughter on the pediatric ward stepped forward without being asked. He was thin, maybe 60, with the careful walk of someone who'd taken shrapnel in both knees. He read the Silver Star citation aloud with the kind of precision that made every word matter. For conspicuous gallantry under fire while providing life-saving medical care during a 12-hour siege in Baghdad. Captain Clarke performed 43 surgical interventions without resupply, sustained combat injuries while refusing evacuation, and saved the lives of soldiers who would have died under standard field protocols. He paused. The citation trembled slightly in his hands, not from age but from recognition. Her action saved 214 lives from that battalion. Her action saved all of us. The general raised his hand, not a gesture of greeting but a salute, formal and deliberate, his eyes wet with something that looked like grief and gratitude combined. "Captain," he said, his voice the sound of someone who'd learned long ago that speaking softly meant people listened harder, "would you permit me the honor?" Dr. Pierce pushed through the gathering crowd like a man who believed the laws of physics bent to his will. "This is hospital property. I'm calling security. That patient needs to be back in bed. This is a HIPAA violation. All of you, disperse immediately." The general raised his hand higher, and something in the gesture, maybe it was the way his shoulders straightened despite the wheelchair, maybe it was the way every Marine present moved 2 inches closer to Hannah in a protective perimeter, made Dr. Pierce stop speaking mid-sentence. The hand stayed raised. The salute held. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the black SUV pulled into the parking lot. It was the kind of vehicle that made nurses instinctively straighten their posture and check their IDs. 2 Pentagon staffers in dark suits emerged first, the kind of suits that had been tailored for men who'd spent their lives making decisions other people paid the price for. The third man was senior, his shoulders carrying the weight of clearances and secrets. He walked directly to the hospital administrator who'd stepped outside to see what the commotion was about, and he spoke quietly enough that nobody else could hear, which meant everyone watched his lips instead. The administrator's face went pale. Not red. Not angry. Pale. The color of someone who'd just realized he'd been standing on the wrong side of a classified operation without knowing it. The IT director, a Marine himself, a gunsmith's son from the base, stepped forward from the small crowd. He was holding a laptop, the kind of thing that looked ordinary until he opened it and showed the senior Pentagon officer 17 different angles of Dr. Pierce in the hallway at 3:22 a.m., attempting to access the surgical bay camera system using his administrative credentials, attempting to delete the thoracotomy footage, attempting to rewrite a record that had already been documented in triplicate by the federal agents already standing on the property. "I saved every frame," the IT director said quietly. He was speaking to the senior officer, but his eyes were on Dr. Pierce. "And I filed a report with the state medical board 40 minutes ago. Evidence tampering." Destruction of patient records. Attempted obstruction of a federal investigation he didn't even know existed. Dr. Pierce's face did something then. It went through 5 expressions in 2 seconds: confusion, rage, calculation, desperation, and finally something that looked like the moment a man realizes his entire world has reorganized itself without his permission. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the 3 Pentagon staffers, at the Marine General, at the 200 people now standing in a parking lot in Colorado Springs bearing witness to the end of his career. "I was protecting the hospital," he started, but his voice had changed. It no longer sounded like a man explaining a decision. It sounded like a man explaining a mistake. She violated protocol. She performed surgery without authorization. She saved your patient's life, the senior Pentagon officer said. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet that comes from knowing you don't need to raise your voice. And you attempted to punish her for it. You attempted to destroy her career. And you attempted to erase evidence of a life-saving procedure because your ego could not tolerate being outmatched by a nurse. Hannah stood very still, still holding the cardboard box of her hospital life, watching the man who'd calculated her destruction realize he'd miscalculated the size of the opposition. 6 months later, she would return to active duty at the Pentagon's request. She would work in the trauma unit at Walter Reed, a position that came with a salary that made her apartment lease feel quaint and an office with a window that overlooked the Potomac. The folded flag, the one from her teammate, the one that had spent 3 years in her hospital locker as a reminder of debts that could never be repaid, only honored, would sit on her desk in a frame beside her new credentials. Dr. Pierce would teach CPR fundamentals at Pikes Peak Community College for minimum wage, working Thursday nights and Saturday mornings for a paycheck that barely covered his alimony. His medical license would be suspended pending investigation. His reputation would become a thing of infamy rather than prestige. The name tag at the urgent care where he eventually found work would read Steve, and every time a patient asked if he was a doctor, he would flinch like the question was a surgical instrument. But that wasn't the end. The trembling in Hannah's hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the knowledge that some people have to be saved twice, once from their circumstances and once from the way they'd learned to survive them. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And we always love hearing from you. Drop a comment and tell us what state or country you're in.